I'm going to share with you the vital information that I found out about the PSB Passif 50s. So before you go out and spend any money on them, I suggest that you watch this video first. First of all, grab yourself a drink, put your feet up, let's discuss the PSB Passif 50s. Let's talk need to knows. The PSB Passif 50s are based on the Passif 2s, which came out in 1974. They're very retro looking speakers and they come on their own stands. A useful thing to know is that it comes with a 60-day returns policy if you buy it directly from PSB's website. There is only one color option and it's called open grain walnut veneer. It's a two-way speaker system with a passive radiator instead of a bass port, which I think makes this a little bit unique. It has a 1-inch titanium dome tweeter and a 6.5-inch paper cone woofer. In terms of price, they cost about €3,000 a pair. So let's see what people are saying about these PSB Passif 50s. So I had a look at John Darko Audio's review channel and let's see what he has to say. He thinks the Passif 50s are very clean and even-handed in their presentation of music. He also says that they have strong dynamics and he recommends that you pair these speakers with an amp that is smooth and rich. He then put the PSB Passif 50s up against the Mission 770s, which I have also reviewed, by the way, check that video out. He says the PSBs are just as detailed as the Mission 770s, however the PSBs are a little bit more transparent. He says the Passif 50s sound less romantic than the Mission 770s. He also says the Passif 50s are more accurate overall and a more neutral sounding speaker. He also says the PSBs are a little bit more airy sounding than the Missions. The PSBs are a smidge more crisp in the lower treble and upper mid range. Interestingly, Darko also says that the Missions are the more forgiving speaker, meaning that you can play more kinds of music and they'll probably sound better overall. He says that the Missions make everything sound fantastic compared to the PSB. When it comes to bass, he says both speakers offer similar performance, but the PSB's sub-bass kicks a little bit harder. Neither speakers apparently need a subwoofer, according to Darko Audio. Darko also did a comparison between the PSB Passif and the Klipsch Forte 4s. He says the Klipsch is twice the price, more forward sounding, and it sounds coloured. He also says the PSB Passif gives just as much detail. In terms of overall sound quality, he couldn't choose which one was better between these two. Steve Guttenberg also did a review on the PSB Passif 50s. Let's see what he had to say. He describes the PSB Passif 50s as sleek and modern. When listening to them, his first reaction was a comfortable, very inviting sound. He thinks the mid-range is very relaxed and beautiful sounding. The high-end, according to Steve, is nice, sweet and relaxed. The bass is very satisfying for a speaker of this size. He says, if you want deep bass, you are going to want a subwoofer. He then says these will not hide poor music recordings, which means they're not a very forgiving speaker. So if you listen to lots of different types of music, perhaps this speaker is not for you. He then goes on to say, if you usually complain about speakers being too bright or aggressive, this speaker is worth considering. He compared the Passifs to the MoFi Source Point 10s. The MoFi is more vivid and brighter. The Passif is a little bit more laid back and mellow by comparison. The Passif is more even tempered and there is more substance to the mid-range. The MoFi by comparison is crisper, more upfront and more forward compared to the PSBs. The MoFi's imaging is more precise, focused and spot on. He says the PSBs are a bit more soft around the edges in the imaging department. The MoFis have a more impactful bass compared to the PSBs and they also go deeper, probably because they have a 10-inch driver. He also compared the Passif 50s to the Zoo DW6s, which are actually floor-standing speakers. He says the Zoo have a thinner mid-range but the bass has more power and the PSB Passif 50s are more neutral sounding. The Zoo DW6 is a better choice for rock music and any music with great dynamics, according to Steve Guttenberg. Another person who reviewed the PSB Passif 50s is Big Kids Toys AV. They said you get really good imaging from the PSB Passif 50s. They also do a good job of projecting their highs and mids. Another tip that they actually had to give about the PSB Passif 50s is that you're going to want a low listening chair when listening to these speakers because of the height of the speakers, or an alternative is to sit further back from them. As for the written reviews, there aren't that many written reviews on the PSB Passif 50s, but there is one that I managed to find, and that's from Hifi and Music Source. They said these PSB Passif 50s are nicely balanced languid, warm and easy on the ear kind of speakers, and they look stylish too. Moving on to the forums, let's see what people actually have to say about these. One user in the forums bought some PSB Passif 50s. He received his Passif 50s on Monday morning around 11 AM. He then returned them by FedEx to the dealer on Wednesday afternoon. He says that he queued up some high-res songs to listen on his Blue Sound streamer, and he had a glass of wine in hand. He was underwhelmed by these speakers. Like all PSBs, he said that these sounded accurate, neutral and balanced with a smooth treble. He also says they weren't fatiguing to listen to. However, he said that something was missing, not something he ever associated with PSB. In his room with his amp, they sounded too polite and too reserved, lacking attack and lacking dynamics. He also goes on to say that the speaker's sealed design was bottling up the music, requiring him to crank the volume too much for the music to come alive. He just didn't feel emotional listening to these speakers apparently, and he said that in his room these sounded constrained. Finally, he said that his issue wasn't the bass or the top to bottom balance. The issue that he has was the musical enjoyment and the level of involvement. However, another forum user had a completely different experience. This person says, I've had the chance to audition the Passif 50s with two more integrated amps, a name Supernate 2 and a truly tiny little topping PA3. In both auditions, the Passif 50s sang nicely. Another forum user also gave his experience about the Mission Passif 50s. He said he went to a hi-fi show and he listened to these. During his demo, the PSBs were connected to a NAD C298 power amplifier and an NAD C658 preamp. He says that they sounded gorgeous. He also goes on to say that it wouldn't surprise him at all if you measured these and they had major flaws, but he enjoyed the experience anyway. So overall, what do I think about the PSB Passif 50? Should you shortlist it, and what's the overall impression that I'm getting? Overall, it kind of sounds to me that the PSB Passif 50s against the Mission 770s, perhaps the Passif 50s are a little bit more transparent overall, and they're good at resolving detail. However, from the experiences that I'm reading, it sounds a bit like the PSBs are a little bit divisive. I didn't really get the feeling that they had any outstanding qualities, judging by people's reviews. It kind of sounds to me that this speaker is going for the kind of accurate sounding vibe, which is not a bad thing at all. And that makes sense because one of the people that ordered these in the forums said that they didn't really sound very musically engaging, so I can kind of get that. However, Darko Audio said that these PSBs have very strong dynamics. So yeah, my feeling on these speakers is they're probably going to be more accurate and neutral sounding, and perhaps they don't have any personality, any character, but that's just what I'm getting from reading these reviews. It's very difficult to determine that without actually hearing them with multiple amps in multiple rooms. So if you have heard the PSB Passif 50, please share your experience down below, as we'd all like to know. That's all I've got to say for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.